The late 20th century witnessed an extraordinary transformation in how humanity envisioned its perfect future. Two powerful currents of utopian thinking emerged during these 3 decades, each promising to solve the fundamental problems that had plagued human civilization for millennia. The first current flowed from the rapid advancement of computer technology and the birth of the Internet, creating dreams of digital paradise where information would be free, democracy would flourish, and human connection would transcend all boundaries. The second current arose from growing environmental consciousness, as people began to understand that their industrial utopian dreams of the past had created an ecological nightmare that threatened the very planet they called home. The story of technological utopianism begins in the early 1970s, when computers were still massive machines that filled entire rooms and required teams of specialists to operate. Most people had never seen a computer, let alone used one, yet visionary thinkers already imagined a future where these electronic brains would transform every aspect of human life. The first personal computers appeared in the mid-1970s, crude machines with names like the Altair 8800 that required users to flip switches and interpret blinking lights. But enthusiasts saw something revolutionary in these primitive devices. They believed that by putting computing power directly into the hands of ordinary people, they could democratize information and break the monopoly that governments and large corporations held over knowledge and communication. Steve Jobs famously described the personal computer as a bicycle for the mind, a tool that would amplify human intelligence just as the bicycle amplified human physical capability. This metaphor captured the essence of early technological utopianism, the belief that technology could extend and enhance human capabilities in ways that would eliminate many of the limitations and inequalities that had always defined human society. When Apple introduced the Apple II computer in 1977, it represented more than just a product launch. It symbolized the dawn of a new age, where technology would serve not just businesses and governments, but individuals seeking to expand their intellectual horizons and creative potential. The democratization of computing power sparked dreams that went far beyond mere convenience or efficiency. Early computer enthusiasts believed they were witnessing the birth of a new form of human organization, one based on the free flow of information rather than the traditional hierarchies of power and wealth. They imagined networks of interconnected computers, creating communities where merit and ideas mattered more than social status or geographic location. This vision gained momentum throughout the 1980s as personal computers became more powerful and user-friendly, with graphical interfaces replacing cryptic command lines and software becoming accessible to people without technical training. Virtual reality emerged as perhaps the most ambitious technological utopian dream of the 1980s. Jaron Lanier, who coined the term virtual reality, described it as the ultimate creative medium, a technology that would allow people to experience any conceivable environment or situation without the limitations of physical reality. Early virtual reality systems were crude and expensive, but they inspired visions of digital worlds where people could live out their deepest fantasies, explore impossible landscapes, and interact with others in ways that transcended the boundaries of race, gender, age, and physical appearance. Science fiction writers like William Gibson painted pictures of cyberspace as a parallel universe where human consciousness could exist independently of the physical body, free from the constraints and inequalities of the material world. The development of virtual reality technology went hand in hand with broader cultural changes that made digital utopias seem increasingly plausible. The personal computer revolution had already begun to change how people worked, learned and communicated. Video games evolved from simple electronic diversions into complex interactive experiences that could absorb players for hours. Computer networks allowed people to share information and communicate across vast distances instantaneously. Each technological advance seemed to validate the utopian vision of a future where digital technology would solve fundamental human problems and create new forms of social organization based on cooperation rather than competition. The emergence of the Internet in the 1990s marked the culmination of decades of technological utopian thinking. What had begun as a military research project called ARPANET gradually evolved into a global network that connected millions of computers and billions of people. The World Wide Web, invented by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, made this vast network accessible to ordinary users, creating a system where anyone could publish information and anyone else could access it from anywhere in the world. For the first time in human history, it seemed possible that all human knowledge could be made freely available to everyone, regardless of their economic status, geographic location, or social position. The early Internet inspired utopian visions that went far beyond mere information sharing. Enthusiasts believed that global computer networks would create new forms of democracy where ordinary citizens could participate directly in political decision-making, bypassing the traditional representatives and institutions that had often failed to serve their interests. They imagined virtual communities where people would form relationships based on shared interests and values rather than accidents of geography or birth. They predicted that the Internet would break down cultural barriers and create a global consciousness that would make war, prejudice and nationalism obsolete. John Perry Barlow captured this optimistic spirit in his famous Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, written in 1996. Barlow, a former lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who had become a digital rights activist, proclaimed that cyberspace was a realm beyond the reach of traditional governments and their outdated laws. He declared that the Internet would be governed by its own ethics and social contracts, created by consensus among its users rather than imposed by external authorities. In Barlow's vision, cyberspace represented humanity's chance to create a truly free society, one based on the voluntary cooperation of equals rather than the coercion and hierarchy that had characterized human civilization throughout history. The commercialization of the Internet in the mid-1990s only seemed to strengthen these utopian visions. Companies like Amazon, Yahoo and eBay demonstrated that the Internet could create new forms of commerce that were more efficient and democratic than traditional retail systems. Small businesses could reach global markets, entrepreneurs could start companies with minimal capital, and consumers could access a wider variety of goods and services at lower prices. The stock market boom of the late 1990s, driven largely by Internet companies, seemed to validate the belief that digital technology would create unprecedented prosperity and opportunity for everyone. Bill Gates embodied this technological optimism in his 1995 book, The Road Ahead, where he predicted that advances in computing and telecommunications would solve many of humanity's most persistent problems. Gates envisioned a future where technology would eliminate poverty by creating new economic opportunities, improve education by making high-quality learning resources available to everyone, and promote global understanding by connecting people across cultural and linguistic barriers. He believed that the same market forces that had driven the rapid improvement and cost reduction of computer technology would eventually make advanced digital tools accessible to everyone, regardless of their economic circumstances. Nicholas Negroponte of the MIT Media Lab made even bolder predictions in his 1995 book, Being Digital. Negroponte argued that the shift from atoms to bits, from physical objects to digital information, would fundamentally transform human society. He predicted that digital technology would eliminate many forms of scarcity and inequality by making it possible to distribute information, entertainment, and educational resources at virtually no cost. In Negroponte's vision, the digital revolution would be more profound than the Industrial Revolution, creating a world where geographic location became irrelevant, where small nations could compete with large ones, and where individual creativity and intelligence mattered more than inherited wealth or political connections. However, even as these technological utopian visions reached their peak in the late 1990s, a parallel movement was developing that offered a very different vision of the perfect society. The environmental movement had been growing since the 1960s, driven by increasing awareness of the ecological costs of industrial development and technological progress. While computer enthusiasts dreamed of transcending physical limitations through digital technology, environmental activists argued that humanity needed to reconnect with the natural world and learn to live within ecological limits. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, marked a turning point in environmental consciousness. Carson documented how pesticides like DDT were poisoning the environment and threatening wildlife populations, challenging the assumption that chemical technology always represented progress. Her book sparked an environmental awakening that led to the first Earth Day in 1970, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and the passage of landmark environmental legislation like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. More importantly for utopian thinking, Silent Spring introduced the idea that true progress might require restraint rather than endless expansion, harmony with nature rather than domination over it. The 1972 publication of The Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome marked another crucial moment in the development of environmental utopianism. This study, based on computer models of global resource consumption and population growth, predicted that industrial civilization would collapse within a century unless humanity dramatically changed its approach to economic development. Rather than seeing this as a pessimistic forecast, many environmental thinkers interpreted it as a call to create a new kind of utopia, one based on sustainability, conservation, and ecological balance rather than material accumulation and technological domination. Ernest Callenbach's 1975 novel Ecotopia provided a detailed blueprint for this new kind of perfect society. Set in a fictional nation comprising Northern California, Oregon, and Washington that had seceded from the United States, Ecotopia depicted a society that had achieved prosperity and happiness through ecological principles rather than industrial growth. In Callenbach's vision, cities were designed to integrate with natural systems. Energy came entirely from renewable sources. Transportation relied on electric vehicles and trains rather than private automobiles, and work was organized around human fulfillment rather than maximum productivity. The novel became a bestseller and inspired countless real-world experiments in sustainable living. The environmental utopian movement drew inspiration from indigenous cultures that had maintained sustainable relationships with their environments for thousands of years. Unlike the technological utopians who looked to the future for salvation, environmental utopians often looked to the past for models of how human societies could live in harmony with nature. They studied Native American agricultural practices, traditional ecological knowledge and pre-industrial social structures for insights into how modern civilization might be reorganized along more sustainable lines. Permaculture emerged in the 1970s as perhaps the most systematic attempt to translate these insights into practical action. Developed by Australians Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, permaculture was both a design philosophy and a set of practical techniques for creating sustainable human settlements. The word itself combined permanent and agriculture, reflecting the movement's focus on creating agricultural systems that could be maintained indefinitely without depleting the soil or other natural resources. But permaculture thinking went far beyond farming to encompass architecture, energy systems, waste management, economics, and social organization. The permaculture movement was based on three core ethics: care for the earth, care for people, and fair share, ensuring that resources were distributed equitably rather than concentrated in the hands of a few. These ethics were implemented through design principles that emphasized working with natural processes rather than against them, using renewable resources wherever possible, minimizing waste and pollution, and creating diverse, resilient systems that could adapt to changing conditions. Permaculture practitioners believed that by following these principles, human communities could meet their needs while actually improving rather than degrading their local environments. Permaculture principles influenced the development of the broader sustainable communities movement, which sought to create intentional communities that demonstrated alternative ways of living. These communities, sometimes called eco-villages, experimented with everything from organic farming and renewable energy to consensus decision-making and alternative economic systems. They served as living laboratories for testing ideas about how human society might be reorganized to achieve both ecological sustainability and social justice. The Findhorn Foundation in Scotland became one of the most famous and successful examples of this environmental utopian experiment. Founded in 1962 by Peter and Eileen Caddy and Dorothy McLean, Findhorn began as a small spiritual community living in caravans on a remote peninsula in northern Scotland. The founders claimed to receive guidance from spiritual beings they called devas, or nature spirits, who provided advice on how to grow food in the area's sandy, seemingly infertile soil. Whether through spiritual intervention, innovative organic farming techniques, or simply dedicated hard work, the community succeeded in creating a remarkable garden that produced vegetables of extraordinary size and quality. Findhorn's famous 40-pound cabbages became symbols of what was possible when humans worked in cooperation with natural forces rather than trying to dominate them. The community's success attracted visitors from around the world, many of whom stayed to join the experiment in sustainable living. By the 1990s, Findhorn had grown into a community of over 400 people living in energy-efficient homes, working in organic gardens, and making decisions through consensus-based governance structures. The community generated its own renewable energy, processed its own waste through biological systems, and created a local economy based on cooperation rather than competition. What made Findhorn particularly significant in the history of utopian thinking was its attempt to integrate spiritual, ecological, and social transformation. Unlike earlier utopian experiments that focused primarily on changing economic or political structures, Findhorn emphasized the need for inner transformation as well as outer change. Community members engaged in meditation, personal growth work, and spiritual practices alongside their practical work in gardens, workshops, and businesses. They believed that creating a sustainable society required not just new technologies and institutions, but new forms of consciousness that recognized the interconnection of all life. The success of communities like Findhorn inspired the creation of hundreds of similar experiments around the world. The Global Eco-Village Network, founded in 1995, connected these communities and helped them share knowledge and resources. Each community developed its own unique approach to sustainable living, but they shared common commitments to ecological responsibility, social justice, and spiritual development. Some focused on organic farming and appropriate technology, others on alternative education and healing practices, still others on artistic expression and cultural innovation. The co-housing movement, which originated in Denmark in the 1970s and spread to other countries, represented a more mainstream approach to environmental utopianism. Co-housing communities consisted of privately owned homes clustered around shared common facilities like kitchens, workshops, and gardens. Residents maintained their privacy and independence while sharing resources and participating in community decision-making. The design of co-housing communities encouraged social interaction and reduced environmental impact through shared facilities, car-free areas, and energy-efficient buildings. Co-housing communities demonstrated that environmental utopian principles could be adapted to serve people who were not ready to join intentional communities but wanted to live more sustainably and socially connected lives. By the 1990s, dozens of co-housing communities had been built in Europe and North America, proving that there was significant demand for alternatives to conventional suburban development. These communities showed measurably lower environmental impacts than comparable conventional neighborhoods, while surveys indicated that residents reported higher levels of life satisfaction and social connection. The environmental justice movement that emerged in the 1980s added another dimension to environmental utopianism by highlighting the connection between ecological degradation and social inequality. Environmental justice activists documented how pollution, toxic waste, and environmental hazards were disproportionately concentrated in low-income communities and communities of color. They argued that any truly sustainable society would need to address both ecological and social justice concerns simultaneously. This analysis led to more sophisticated understandings of what environmental utopia might look like. Rather than simply returning to some idealized pre-industrial past, environmental utopians began to envision futures that combined the best of traditional ecological wisdom with appropriate modern technologies and more equitable social institutions. They recognized that sustainability was not just about reducing material consumption, but about creating social systems that met everyone's basic needs while staying within ecological limits. The concept of bioregionalism emerged as one attempt to reimagine human social organization along ecological lines. Bioregionalists argued that political and economic boundaries should follow natural ecological boundaries rather than arbitrary lines drawn on maps. They envisioned societies organized around watersheds, mountain ranges, and other natural features, with local economies based on what each bioregion could sustainably produce. This approach would require people to develop intimate knowledge of their local ecosystems and would create strong incentives for environmental stewardship. By the 1990s, environmental utopian thinking had evolved from simple calls to return to nature into sophisticated visions of ecological civilization that could support large human populations while maintaining environmental health. The concept of sustainable development, popularized by the 1987 Brundtland Commission report, attempted to reconcile economic development with environmental protection by defining sustainability as meeting present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro brought together world leaders to address global environmental challenges and marked the mainstreaming of environmental concerns that had once been considered radical or utopian. The summit produced international agreements on climate change and biodiversity conservation, along with Agenda 21, a comprehensive plan for sustainable development. While these agreements fell far short of the transformative changes advocated by environmental utopians, they represented unprecedented global recognition that current patterns of development were unsustainable. The Internet played a crucial role in connecting environmental activists and spreading information about sustainable alternatives. Environmental organizations used email lists, websites, and online databases to coordinate campaigns, share research, and build networks of supporters. The same digital technologies that inspired technological utopian visions also enabled environmental utopians to organize more effectively and reach larger audiences with their alternative visions of the future. The relationship between technological and environmental utopianism was complex and sometimes contradictory. Some environmental thinkers viewed technology as fundamentally incompatible with ecological sustainability and called for a return to simpler, less technologically dependent ways of life. Others, sometimes called eco-modernists, argued that advanced technology could be part of the solution to environmental problems if it was designed and used properly. They pointed to renewable energy technologies, organic farming techniques, and green building materials as examples of how human ingenuity could be channeled toward ecological goals. The permaculture movement exemplified this more nuanced approach to technology. While permaculture practitioners generally favored simple, locally appropriate technologies over complex, centralized systems, they weren't anti-technology. They embraced technologies that worked with natural processes, like solar panels, wind turbines, composting toilets, and grey water systems, while rejecting those that were wasteful, polluting, or socially destructive. The key was to evaluate technologies based on their ecological and social impacts rather than simply their efficiency or profitability. By the end of the 20th century, both technological and environmental utopianism had produced significant real-world changes while falling short of their most ambitious goals. The Internet had indeed democratized access to information and created new forms of social organization, but it had also become dominated by commercial interests and government surveillance in ways that early utopian thinkers had not anticipated. Environmental awareness had grown dramatically and influenced policy changes around the world, but global environmental problems like climate change and biodiversity loss continued to worsen. The dot-com boom and bust of the late 1990s and early 2000s revealed some of the limitations of technological utopianism. Many Internet companies failed to find viable business models, leading to massive losses for investors and workers. The promise that digital technology would create a more democratic economy was challenged by the emergence of large technology corporations that accumulated unprecedented power and wealth. Concerns about privacy, surveillance, and the social impacts of digital technology began to temper the utopian enthusiasm of the early Internet years. Similarly, environmental utopian experiments faced practical challenges that limited their broader impact. While communities like Findhorn succeeded in creating sustainable local systems, they struggled to influence larger social and economic structures. The global economy remained organized around principles of endless growth and resource extraction that were fundamentally incompatible with ecological sustainability. Environmental problems required collective action at scales that small, intentional communities could not achieve on their own. However, both technological and environmental utopianism left lasting legacies that continued to influence social development beyond the year 2000. The Internet infrastructure and digital technologies developed during this period provided the foundation for subsequent innovations in communication, commerce, and social organization. The environmental movement succeeded in raising awareness about ecological issues and establishing the concept of sustainability as a legitimate goal for both individuals and institutions. Perhaps most importantly, both movements demonstrated that ordinary people could envision and work toward alternatives to existing social arrangements. The technological utopians showed that small groups of dedicated individuals could develop technologies that transformed entire societies. The environmental utopians proved that communities could live more sustainably while maintaining high quality of life. Both movements challenged the assumption that existing institutions and practices were inevitable or unchangeable. The period from 1970 to 2000 represented a unique moment in utopian thinking, when rapid technological change and growing environmental awareness combined to inspire new visions of human possibility. While neither technological nor environmental utopianism achieved their most ambitious goals, they succeeded in expanding the range of futures that people could imagine and work toward. They demonstrated that perfect societies might not be achievable, but better societies were certainly possible for those willing to experiment, innovate and persevere in the face of obstacles and setbacks. Corporate dreams and digital promises, the search for modern paradise. The story of how humanity searched for paradise in the late 20th and early 21st centuries takes us through gleaming corporate boardrooms and glowing computer screens. This tale unfolds across 3 decades when millions of people believed that free markets and digital technology would finally deliver the perfect society that philosophers had dreamed about for thousands of years. In the 1980s, something remarkable happened in America. A new group of thinkers emerged who believed they had discovered the secret to creating heaven on earth. These weren't religious leaders or revolutionary communists. They were economists, business leaders and politicians who proclaimed that the free market itself was the path to utopia. Their story begins with a simple but powerful idea called supply-side economics, which promised that if governments would just get out of the way and let businesses do whatever they wanted, prosperity would rain down on everyone like manna from heaven. The champions of this market utopia argued that when rich people and corporations paid fewer taxes, they would use that extra money to create jobs and invest in new businesses. This would make everyone richer, they claimed, because the benefits would trickle down from the wealthy to the poor like water flowing downhill. President Ronald Reagan became the most famous supporter of these ideas, cutting taxes for the wealthy and removing regulations that limited what businesses could do. His supporters called it the Reagan Revolution, and they believed it would transform America into a land where everyone could achieve their dreams through hard work and free enterprise. The believers in market utopia had a vision that went far beyond just making money. They imagined a world where competition between businesses would drive innovation so fast that technology would solve every human problem. Poverty would disappear because businesses would create so many jobs that everyone would have work. War would become unnecessary because nations would be too busy trading with each other to fight. Disease would be conquered by pharmaceutical companies competing to develop new medicines. Even pollution would be solved by businesses finding profitable ways to clean up the environment. This dream seemed to be coming true during the 1980s economic boom. New millionaires appeared almost overnight, especially in places like Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Shopping malls filled with consumers buying endless varieties of products. Television shows celebrated the lives of wealthy business leaders, and movies portrayed corporate executives as heroes. The message was clear. Capitalism wasn't just an economic system, it was a way to create paradise on earth. But the market utopians were just getting started. In 1989, a scholar named Francis Fukuyama published an essay that would become one of the most famous pieces of writing about the end of the Cold War. Fukuyama declared that history itself had ended, not in the sense that nothing would ever happen again, but in the sense that humanity had finally figured out the best way to organize society. Liberal democracy, combined with free market capitalism, had defeated all other systems, he argued, and would now spread across the entire world. Fukuyama's vision was breathtaking in its scope. He imagined a future where every country would adopt democratic government and capitalist economics. Wars between nations would become rare because democratic countries almost never fight each other, and trade would make everyone too prosperous to want conflict. Technological progress would accelerate as businesses competed to create better products. Individual freedom would flourish as people gained the economic means to pursue their own dreams and governments respected their rights. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 seemed to prove Fukuyama right. The communist system that had promised to create a workers' paradise had instead created poverty, oppression, and environmental disaster. Meanwhile, the capitalist West appeared to be thriving. Stock markets soared to record heights. New products like personal computers and cell phones were transforming daily life. The message was clear: the free market had won, and utopia was just around the corner. As the 1990s began, this confidence in market utopia reached new heights with the rise of the internet and the dot-com boom. Suddenly, a new generation of entrepreneurs emerged who believed that digital technology would not just make them rich, but would actually save the world. These weren't just business people, they were missionaries spreading the gospel of the new economy. The new economy promised to be different from the old industrial economy in fundamental ways. Instead of being based on making physical things in factories, it would be based on creating and sharing information. Instead of being limited by geography, it would connect people across the entire globe. Instead of being controlled by big corporations and governments, it would empower individuals to start their own businesses and express their own ideas. Most importantly, it would grow so fast that it would create prosperity for everyone. The prophets of the new economy had a vision that sounded like science fiction but felt completely realistic in the 1990s. They imagined a future where everyone would work from home, connected to the global internet. Physical offices would become obsolete as people collaborated with colleagues on different continents. Shopping would happen online with products delivered directly to consumers' doors. Entertainment would be customized to individual tastes and available on demand. Education would be revolutionized as students could learn from the world's best teachers through their computers. The stock market seemed to confirm these dreams. Companies that had never made a profit saw their stock prices soar simply because they had a website. Young entrepreneurs became billionaires overnight. The Nasdaq stock index, which included many technology companies, rose from around 1,000 points in 1995 to over 5,000 points in 2000. Money seemed to grow on trees, and the trees were made of fiber optic cable. But the new economy utopians promised more than just wealth. They believed that digital technology would solve fundamental human problems. The internet would spread democracy by giving everyone access to information and the ability to organize politically. It would end poverty by creating new economic opportunities for people in developing countries. It would improve education by making knowledge freely available to anyone with a computer. It would even bring world peace by connecting people across cultural and national boundaries. The dot-com boom created a new kind of hero, the tech entrepreneur. These weren't the ruthless businessmen of the 1980s who cared only about making money. They were young idealists who wanted to change the world. They wore casual clothes instead of suits, worked in open offices instead of corner suites, and talked about making the world a better place instead of just maximizing profits. They were the new missionaries of market utopia, spreading the gospel of digital capitalism. However, the dot-com boom came to a sudden and painful end in 2000, when the stock market crashed. Many internet companies went out of business, and billions of dollars in investments disappeared. The promised new economy paradise suddenly seemed like a mirage. But the believers in market utopia didn't give up. Instead, they shifted their focus to an even grander vision. Globalization would create worldwide prosperity and peace. The globalization utopians of the 2000s believed that free trade between countries would lift everyone out of poverty. They imagined a world where goods, services, money and ideas could flow freely across borders. Companies would move their factories to countries with the cheapest labor, making products more affordable for everyone. Workers in poor countries would get jobs in these factories, gradually raising their standard of living. Consumers in rich countries would benefit from lower prices and greater variety of products. This vision seemed to be working in the early 2000s. Countries like China and India experienced rapid economic growth as they opened their economies to international trade. Millions of people were lifted out of extreme poverty. New technologies like container ships and the internet made it easier and cheaper to move goods and information around the world. The World Trade Organization grew to include more countries, and free trade agreements were signed between nations. The globalization utopians believed they were creating a new kind of paradise, one based on economic interdependence rather than political unity. Countries would become so economically connected that war would become impossible, they argued, because no nation would want to destroy its own customers and suppliers. Democracy would spread as economic prosperity created a middle class that demanded political rights. Environmental problems would be solved as wealthy countries shared clean technologies with poor ones. But while economists and politicians were preaching the gospel of globalization, a new group of utopian dreamers was emerging in Silicon Valley. These were the tech entrepreneurs who would define the early 21st century, and their vision of paradise was even more ambitious than anything that had come before. The Silicon Valley culture of the 2000s was built around a simple but powerful philosophy: move fast and break things. This meant that entrepreneurs should launch their products quickly, learn from their mistakes, and constantly improve. They shouldn't worry about disrupting existing industries or changing how people lived their lives. In fact, disruption was seen as a good thing because it meant that better technologies were replacing worse ones. The tech utopians believed that every human problem could be solved through better technology. Poverty would be eliminated by creating new economic opportunities through the internet. Disease would be conquered by using computers to analyze medical data and develop new treatments. Climate change would be solved by using technology to create clean energy and reduce waste. Even death itself might be conquered through advances in biotechnology and artificial intelligence. These weren't just business plans, they were moral crusades. The tech entrepreneurs saw themselves as heroes fighting to save the world from inefficiency, inequality and ignorance. They worked long hours, not just to make money, but to fulfill their mission of making life better for everyone. They created companies with names like Google, whose original motto was "Don't be evil," and Facebook, which promised to make the world more open and connected. The tech utopians had a unique vision of how their paradise would work. Unlike the political utopias of the past, which required governments to force people to behave in certain ways, the tech utopia would be created through voluntary choices. People would choose to use technologies that made their lives better, and the cumulative effect of millions of individual choices would transform society. The free market would ensure that only the best technologies survived, and competition between companies would drive constant innovation. This vision seemed to be working in the early 2000s. Google created a search engine that could find any information on the internet in seconds. Amazon made it possible to buy almost anything and have it delivered to your door. Apple designed computers and phones that were both powerful and easy to use. These companies didn't just make money, they made life better for millions of people. But the tech utopians were just getting started. As the internet matured in the 2000s, new platforms emerged that promised to create perfect virtual communities. These weren't just websites, they were entire digital worlds where people could live, work, and play together. The first major experiment in digital utopia was Second Life, launched in 2003. This was a virtual world where people could create avatars, buy virtual land, build virtual houses, and interact with other users from around the world. The creators of Second Life believed they were offering something revolutionary, a chance for people to escape the limitations of their physical lives and create perfect digital versions of themselves. Second Life attracted millions of users who were fascinated by the possibility of living in a virtual paradise. They could fly through the air, transform their appearance at will, and create beautiful landscapes limited only by their imagination. Real companies opened virtual offices in Second Life, universities held classes there, and some people even made real money by selling virtual goods and services. The vision behind Second Life was that virtual worlds would eventually become so realistic and useful that people would spend most of their time there. Physical reality would become less important as people found better opportunities for work, entertainment, and social connection in digital spaces. The problems of the physical world, poverty, disease, environmental destruction, would become irrelevant as people created perfect virtual alternatives. But even as Second Life was creating virtual paradise, other tech companies were working on a different approach to digital utopia. Instead of creating entirely artificial worlds, they wanted to use technology to improve the real world by connecting people in new ways. Facebook, launched in 2004, promised to make the world more open and connected by allowing people to share their lives with friends and family online. The founder, Mark Zuckerberg, believed that social media would create a more transparent and democratic society. People would be able to organize politically, share information freely, and maintain relationships across vast distances. The platform would break down barriers between different groups and create a global community based on shared interests rather than geography. Wikipedia, launched in 2001 but reaching maturity in the mid-2000s, proved that collaborative digital projects could actually work. This online encyclopedia allowed anyone to contribute articles and edit existing ones. Traditional experts worried that Wikipedia would be filled with errors and biased information, but the opposite happened. Millions of volunteers around the world worked together to create the largest and most comprehensive encyclopedia in human history. Studies showed that Wikipedia was just as accurate as traditional encyclopedias, and it covered topics that no printed encyclopedia could include. The success of Wikipedia seemed to prove that the Internet could create new forms of paradise based on cooperation rather than competition. People would volunteer their time and knowledge to create resources that benefited everyone. The old model of expert-controlled information would be replaced by a democratic model where anyone could contribute. This vision suggested that digital technology could solve the ancient problem of how to organize society by making it possible for millions of people to work together without central control. Twitter, launched in 2006, promised to democratize information and give everyone a voice. The platform allowed users to share short messages with their followers, creating a global conversation that could happen in real time. The creators of Twitter believed that their platform would break down the barriers between ordinary people and powerful institutions. Politicians, celebrities, and business leaders would have to engage directly with their constituents instead of communicating through intermediaries like journalists and publicists. The Twitter utopians imagined a world where information would flow freely and instantly. Breaking news would be reported by ordinary people who witnessed events firsthand. Political movements would organize through hashtags and viral messages. Corrupt governments and corporations would be exposed by citizen journalists who could bypass traditional media. The platform would create a more democratic and transparent society where everyone had equal access to information and the ability to influence public opinion. But perhaps the most ambitious digital utopia was Bitcoin, launched in 2009. This wasn't just a new technology, it was an attempt to create a completely new kind of money that would be controlled by no government or bank. The creator, who used the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, believed that traditional money was fundamentally flawed because it was controlled by central authorities who could manipulate its value for their own benefit. Bitcoin promised to create a trustless system where people could exchange value without needing to trust any central authority. The currency would be managed by a network of computers that would verify transactions and create new coins according to mathematical rules that could never be changed. No government could print more Bitcoin to cause inflation. No bank could freeze someone's account or block their transactions. No corporation could manipulate the system for profit. The Bitcoin utopians believed they were creating a new kind of paradise based on mathematical perfection rather than human institutions. Their system would be completely fair because it treated everyone equally. It would be completely transparent because all transactions were recorded on a public ledger. It would be completely secure because it was protected by cryptography that would take centuries to break even with the most powerful computers. The vision behind Bitcoin was that digital money would eventually replace traditional currencies and banks. People would be able to send money anywhere in the world instantly and cheaply. The poor would gain access to financial services that banks had denied them. Authoritarian governments would lose the ability to control their citizens' economic lives. The entire global financial system would become more efficient and fair. But as these digital utopias matured in the 2010s, it became clear that the reality was more complicated than the promises. Social media platforms that were supposed to connect the world and promote understanding instead created echo chambers where people only heard opinions that confirmed their existing beliefs. The free flow of information that was supposed to promote democracy instead enabled the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories. The global conversation that was supposed to bring people together instead became a source of political polarization and social conflict. The story of how social media promises clashed with reality reveals the fundamental challenges of creating digital paradise. Facebook, which had promised to make the world more open and connected, instead became a platform where foreign governments could manipulate elections and where false information could spread faster than truth. The algorithms that were designed to show users content they would find interesting instead created filter bubbles that reinforced existing prejudices and prevented people from encountering different viewpoints. Twitter, which had promised to democratize information, instead became a platform where the loudest and most extreme voices often drowned out moderate and thoughtful ones. The equal access that was supposed to level the playing field between ordinary people and powerful institutions instead gave equal platform to experts and conspiracy theorists, making it harder for users to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information. The problems with social media revealed a deeper issue with the digital utopian vision. The tech entrepreneurs had assumed that connecting people and giving them access to information would automatically create a better society. They believed that truth would triumph over falsehood in a free marketplace of ideas, and that people would naturally choose to use technology in ways that benefited everyone. But reality proved more complex. People often preferred information that confirmed their existing beliefs over information that challenged them. They were more likely to share emotional content than factual content. They were vulnerable to manipulation by those who understood how to exploit the psychological mechanisms that social media platforms use to capture attention. The digital platforms that were supposed to create paradise instead became tools for division and manipulation. Foreign governments used them to interfere in elections. Terrorist groups used them to recruit followers and spread propaganda. Criminals used them to commit fraud and harassment. The same technologies that connected people across the globe also connected people to harmful influences they would never have encountered in their local communities. The story of Wikipedia stands out as a rare success among digital utopian experiments. Unlike other platforms that were controlled by corporations seeking profit, Wikipedia was managed by a non-profit organization dedicated to providing free access to knowledge. Unlike platforms that relied on algorithms to determine what users saw, Wikipedia was edited by human volunteers who were committed to accuracy and neutrality. Wikipedia's success showed that digital utopian projects could work under the right conditions. The platform had clear rules about what kinds of content were acceptable. It had processes for resolving disputes between editors. It had ways to identify and remove vandalism and misinformation. Most importantly, it was designed to serve the public interest rather than maximize profit or engagement. The lesson of Wikipedia was that digital technology alone was not enough to create paradise. The design of the platform, the rules that governed its use, and the motivations of the people who ran it were all crucial factors. A platform designed to maximize profit would behave very differently from one designed to serve the public interest. A platform run by volunteers would have different priorities than one run by employees of a corporation. As the 2010s progressed, the failures of digital utopian projects became increasingly obvious. The 2016 election saw foreign interference on social media platforms reach unprecedented levels. The Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed how personal data collected by Facebook had been used to manipulate voters. The rise of fake news and conspiracy theories showed how digital platforms could spread misinformation faster than traditional media could fact-check it. The tech companies that had once been seen as heroic innovators began to be viewed more skeptically. Critics pointed out that their business models were based on capturing and monetizing users' attention, which created incentives to promote engaging content rather than accurate or beneficial content. The same algorithms that could help users find interesting videos could also lead them down rabbit holes of extremist content. The promise that technology would solve all human problems began to seem naive. Climate change continued to worsen despite advances in clean energy technology. Economic inequality increased even as digital technologies created new forms of wealth. Political polarization intensified even as social media platforms connected people across traditional boundaries. The story of market and digital utopias reveals a fundamental tension in how people think about creating paradise. The market utopians believed that individual choices in a free market would automatically create the best possible society. The digital utopians believed that technology would solve human problems by making information and communication more efficient. Both groups shared a faith that complex social problems could be solved through systems that operated automatically without need for human judgment or democratic deliberation. But the failures of these utopian projects showed that human societies are more complex than markets or technologies. People are not purely rational actors who always make choices that benefit themselves and others. Information is not neutral data that automatically leads to better decisions. Technology is not a force that automatically improves society regardless of how it is designed or used. The quest for paradise through markets and technology also revealed how utopian thinking had evolved since the political utopias of earlier centuries. Instead of requiring people to change their behavior or governments to impose new systems, market and digital utopias promised to create paradise through mechanisms that people could choose to participate in or ignore. This seemed more realistic and achievable than earlier utopian projects that required revolutionary changes to society. But this apparent advantage also became a weakness. Because participation in market and digital utopias was voluntary, their benefits were often distributed unequally. The people who had the most money, education and technical skills were best positioned to benefit from new technologies and market opportunities. Those who lacked these advantages often found themselves excluded from the promised paradise or even harmed by it. The globalization that was supposed to lift all boats instead created winners and losers. Workers in some countries lost their jobs to international competition, while consumers in other countries benefited from lower prices. The digital revolution that was supposed to democratize information instead created new forms of inequality between those who could navigate complex technological systems and those who could not. The story of corporate and digital utopias also shows how utopian thinking adapted to the values and assumptions of late 20th and early 21st century society. Earlier utopian projects had often been explicitly political, seeking to create new forms of government or social organization. The market and digital utopians instead worked within existing political systems, seeking to create paradise through economic and technological change rather than political revolution. This approach reflected broader changes in how people thought about social problems. Instead of looking to governments or political movements for solutions, they increasingly looked to markets and technology. This shift was partly based on the apparent failure of government-led utopian projects in the 20th century, from Soviet communism to the Great Society programs of the 1960s. But the shift toward market and digital solutions also reflected the growing influence of corporate and technological elites who had strong incentives to promote their own vision of paradise. The tech entrepreneurs who promised that their platforms would solve social problems were also building business empires that would make them enormously wealthy. The economists who promoted free market policies often worked for institutions that were funded by corporations that would benefit from deregulation. The story of how these utopian dreams evolved and ultimately fell short provides important lessons about the nature of human society and the challenge of creating better communities. The market utopians were right that competition and innovation can drive progress and create prosperity. The digital utopians were right that technology can solve some problems and create new opportunities for human connection and creativity. But both groups underestimated the complexity of human nature and society. They assumed that people would naturally use freedom and technology in ways that benefited everyone, without considering how these tools could also be used for manipulation, exploitation, and harm. They focused on the technical aspects of their systems without paying enough attention to the social and political contexts in which these systems would operate. The failures of market and digital utopias do not mean that markets and technology are inherently bad or that utopian thinking is pointless. Markets and technology have indeed solved many problems and improved many lives. The challenge is to learn from the failures of these utopian projects to create better systems that capture their benefits while avoiding their pitfalls. This might require combining the insights of market and digital utopians with older wisdom about the importance of democratic institutions, social solidarity, and moral education. It might require designing markets and technologies that are explicitly oriented toward the public good rather than private profit. Most importantly, it might require abandoning the dream of automatic paradise and accepting that creating better societies requires ongoing human effort, judgment, and moral commitment. The search for paradise through markets and technology represents one chapter in humanity's long quest to create better ways of living together. Like earlier utopian projects, these attempts taught valuable lessons about both the possibilities and the limitations of human social organization. The story continues as new generations of dreamers and innovators work to build on these lessons and create better versions of paradise for the future. Modern Challenges to Utopian Thinking, a Complete Story. The story of modern utopian thinking begins in 2008, when the world watched in horror as financial markets collapsed around them. Banks that seemed too big to fail suddenly crumbled like sandcastles hit by ocean waves. Millions of people lost their homes, their jobs, and their faith in the systems they had trusted for decades. The crisis revealed something troubling about human nature and economic systems that utopian thinkers had often ignored. Markets, which many believed would naturally regulate themselves and create prosperity for all, had instead created massive bubbles of speculation and greed. Lehman Brothers, once a towering symbol of financial success, disappeared overnight. Bear Stearns vanished into the hands of J.P. Morgan Chase for the price of a modest office building. The dream that free markets would automatically create the best possible world for everyone suddenly seemed naive and dangerous. As the dust settled from the financial crisis, new cracks began appearing in the foundation of modern democratic societies. In 2016, British voters shocked the world by choosing to leave the European Union in what became known as Brexit. The vote revealed deep divisions between urban and rural communities, young and old citizens, educated and working-class populations. Families split apart over dinner-table arguments about immigration and sovereignty. The European Union, itself a utopian project designed to prevent war and create prosperity through cooperation, suddenly found itself losing one of its most important members. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, American voters elected Donald Trump as president in an election that exposed similar deep social fractures. Coastal cities filled with educated professionals voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton, while rural communities and industrial towns chose Trump by equally large margins. The election revealed that Americans were living in completely different information environments, consuming different news sources, and holding fundamentally different beliefs about reality itself. The rise of social media had promised to connect humanity and democratize information, creating a more informed and connected world. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg had spoken eloquently about connecting every person on Earth and giving everyone a voice. Twitter promoted itself as the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party. YouTube promised to broadcast yourself to the world. These platforms seemed like utopian tools that would break down barriers between people and create unprecedented opportunities for learning and communication. However, the reality proved far more complicated and dangerous. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement and advertising revenue began promoting the most divisive and emotionally charged content. False information spread faster than truth because lies were often more exciting and emotionally satisfying than boring facts. Echo chambers formed as people naturally gravitated toward information that confirmed their existing beliefs. Russian intelligence services exploited these vulnerabilities to interfere in democratic elections. Extremist groups used social media to recruit new members and coordinate attacks. The very technologies that were supposed to bring humanity together began tearing societies apart. The dark potential of social media became horrifyingly clear in Myanmar, where Facebook played a central role in genocide against the Rohingya people. Military leaders and Buddhist monks used Facebook to spread hatred and false information about the Muslim minority group. Posts claiming that Rohingya people were terrorists or foreign invaders went viral, reaching millions of users. The company had only 2 Burmese speakers on staff to monitor content in a country of 50 million people. Facebook's algorithms actually promoted the most inflammatory content because it generated more engagement. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya people were forced to flee their homes, and thousands were killed in violence that was directly fueled by social media hatred. When Facebook executives were asked about their role in the genocide, they claimed they were just a neutral platform, not responsible for how people used their technology. Similar problems emerged on other platforms. Twitter, became a favorite tool of authoritarian leaders around the world who used it to attack journalists, spread propaganda, and intimidate political opponents. Donald Trump used Twitter to circumvent traditional media and speak directly to his supporters, often spreading false information or making threatening statements about political rivals. The platform also became a recruiting ground for terrorist organizations. ISIS used Twitter to share execution videos and attract new fighters from around the world. The company struggled to remove terrorist content fast enough, as new accounts appeared as quickly as old ones were suspended. Meanwhile, Google faced criticism for its cooperation with Chinese censorship through Project Dragonfly, a search engine that would have helped the Chinese government suppress information about human rights and democracy. The company that had once promised to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible was now considering helping one of the world's most repressive governments hide information from its own citizens. Amazon, which had revolutionized commerce and promised to become Earth's most customer-centric company, faced growing criticism for its treatment of warehouse workers. Employees reported being forced to work in dangerous conditions with minimal breaks under constant surveillance. Some workers had to urinate in bottles because bathroom breaks were too time-consuming. The company used sophisticated algorithms to track worker productivity down to the second, firing anyone who failed to meet increasingly demanding quotas. Jeff Bezos became the richest person in human history, while many of his employees relied on food stamps to feed their families. The contrast between utopian promises and harsh realities became impossible to ignore. Then came 2020, a year that would shatter many remaining illusions about human progress and social cooperation. The COVID-19 pandemic began in Wuhan, China, and quickly spread around the world, killing millions of people and shutting down entire economies. The crisis revealed the fragility of global supply chains, the inadequacy of public health systems, and the depth of inequality in supposedly advanced societies. In the United States, the richest country in human history, hospitals ran out of basic protective equipment for healthcare workers. Wealthy Americans fled to country estates, while poor communities suffered disproportionately from both the disease and economic shutdowns. The pandemic exposed how unprepared governments were for predictable crises and how quickly social cooperation could break down under stress. Conspiracy theories flourished as people struggled to make sense of rapidly changing information. Some groups refused to wear masks or get vaccinated, viewing public health measures as attacks on their freedom. The collective action needed to fight the pandemic became impossible in many places due to political polarization and mistrust of institutions. Climate change, meanwhile, became impossible to ignore as extreme weather events multiplied around the world. The summer of 2021 brought unprecedented heat waves that killed hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest, a region known for its mild climate. Wildfire smoke turned skies orange across entire states. Floods devastated communities in Germany and Belgium. Hurricane Ida knocked out power for millions of people in Louisiana and flooded subway stations in New York City. The scientific consensus about human-caused climate change was overwhelming, but political action remained inadequate. Many people continued to deny the reality of climate change or argued that addressing it would harm economic growth. The tragedy of the commons, where individual rational choices lead to collective disaster, played out on a global scale as countries struggled to coordinate responses to a threat that affected everyone, but no one country could solve alone. These reality checks made many people deeply skeptical about utopian thinking itself. If smartphones and social media could lead to genocide, if global markets could crash despite sophisticated regulation, If rich democracies could not handle a pandemic, then perhaps perfect societies were simply impossible. Maybe human nature was too flawed, too selfish, too tribal, to ever create the harmonious communities that utopian thinkers had imagined for centuries. The complexity of modern systems seemed to make unintended consequences inevitable, and the speed of technological change appeared to outpace human wisdom and institutional adaptation. However, despite these failures and disappointments, the human impulse to imagine and create better societies refused to die. New utopian movements emerged that learned from recent failures and adapted to contemporary challenges. These movements were generally more modest in their claims, more aware of potential problems, and more focused on evidence and experimentation rather than grand theories about human nature and social organization. One of the most significant new utopian ideas was universal basic income, a simple concept with revolutionary implications. Instead of the complex welfare systems that had grown up in most developed countries, UBI proposed giving every citizen a regular, unconditional cash payment that would provide basic economic security. The idea gained support from across the political spectrum for different reasons. Conservatives liked its simplicity and potential to reduce bureaucracy. Progressives appreciated its potential to reduce poverty and inequality. Libertarians saw it as a way to shrink government programs while preserving a safety net. Tech entrepreneurs worried that artificial intelligence and automation would eliminate millions of jobs, creating mass unemployment and social instability. UBI seemed like a way to maintain social cohesion and consumer spending even if human labour became less valuable. Finland conducted one of the most rigorous UBI experiments in modern history from 2017 to 2018. The government selected 2,000 unemployed people and gave them €560 per month with no strings attached. Recipients could spend the money however they wanted and did not lose benefits if they found work. The results challenged many assumptions about human motivation and welfare policy. People who received UBI did not become lazy or stop looking for work. Instead, they reported lower levels of stress and depression. They were more likely to accept temporary or part-time work because they did not fear losing benefits. The program did not cause inflation or other economic disruptions that critics had predicted. However, the experiment was too small and short-term to answer all questions about UBI's long-term effects. Meanwhile, in Kenya, the charity Give Directly began conducting an even more ambitious UBI experiment. The organisation gives unconditional cash payments to entire villages in rural Kenya, allowing researchers to study the effects of UBI on complete communities rather than just individuals. Early results showed that recipients used the money to invest in businesses, education and housing rather than wasting it on alcohol or luxury goods as critics had feared. Children stayed in school longer and domestic violence decreased. Local economies grew as people had more money to spend at local businesses. The program created a virtuous cycle where everyone benefited from increased economic activity. These experiments suggested that UBI might address several problems simultaneously. It could reduce poverty directly by giving people money. It could simplify welfare systems by replacing dozens of different programs with one universal payment. It could provide economic security in an era of job insecurity and technological change. Most importantly, it could give people more freedom to pursue education, care for family members, start businesses, or engage in community activities without worrying about meeting basic needs. Another new utopian movement emerged from growing awareness of environmental limits and climate change. The degrowth movement argued that the fundamental problem with modern societies was their obsession with economic growth at any cost. Gross domestic product, the standard measure of national success, counted any spending as positive regardless of whether it actually improved human welfare. An oil spill that required expensive cleanup would increase GDP even though it clearly made society worse off. The degrowth movement proposed intentionally shrinking economic activity while improving quality of life through better distribution of resources, shorter work weeks, stronger communities, and more sustainable consumption patterns. Degrowth advocates pointed out that people in many European countries worked fewer hours and consumed less than Americans, but reported higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction. They argued that, beyond a certain point, additional wealth and consumption did not increase well-being, but instead created stress, environmental damage, and social inequality. Instead of pursuing endless growth on a finite planet, societies should focus on meeting everyone's basic needs while staying within ecological limits. The movement drew inspiration from indigenous cultures that had sustained themselves for thousands of years without depleting natural resources. It also connected to growing research on happiness and well-being that showed the diminishing returns of material wealth. Once people had enough money to meet basic needs and achieve modest comfort, additional income had much smaller effects on life satisfaction than relationships, community engagement, meaningful work, and time for leisure and reflection. A related movement called solar punk emerged from science fiction and design communities, creating vivid images of sustainable high-tech future societies. Unlike the dystopian futures that dominated popular culture, solarpunk imagined worlds where advanced technology served human and environmental flourishing. Cities were filled with vertical farms and green spaces. Solar panels and wind turbines provided clean energy. People lived in cooperative communities and worked collaboratively on creative projects. Advanced manufacturing allowed local communities to produce everything they needed without global supply chains. Artificial intelligence helped manage complex ecological systems and freed humans from repetitive labor. Solarpunk was deliberately optimistic and visually appealing, using art and storytelling to help people imagine alternatives to current systems. The movement recognized that people needed inspiring visions of possible futures, not just criticism of present problems. It combined environmental consciousness with technological optimism, arguing that innovation could solve ecological problems if directed towards sustainability rather than profit maximization. The effective altruism movement represented another new approach to utopian thinking, one based on rigorous analysis rather than emotional appeals or political ideology. Effective altruists used evidence and reason to figure out how to do the most good possible with limited resources. They asked difficult questions about charity and social change. Which interventions actually helped people? How could donors compare the value of saving lives in poor countries versus reducing animal suffering versus preventing future catastrophes? How should people choose careers that would maximize their positive impact on the world? The movement attracted philosophers, economists, and other researchers who applied scientific methods to moral questions. They discovered that some charitable interventions were hundreds or thousands of times more effective than others. Providing bed nets to prevent malaria in Africa cost only a few dollars per life saved, while many popular charities in rich countries spent thousands of dollars to produce much smaller benefits. The Against Malaria Foundation could save a life for about $3,000, while Make-A-Wish Foundation spent thousands of dollars to grant wishes to sick children without necessarily extending their lives. Effective altruists also worried about existential risks that could threaten all future human generations. Climate change, nuclear war, engineered pandemics, and artificial intelligence posed risks not just to people currently alive, but to all the billions of people who might live in the future if humanity survived and flourished. From this long-termist perspective, preventing human extinction was enormously valuable, even if it required significant sacrifices today. The movement had attracted billions of dollars in donations and influenced thousands of career choices. Major donors like Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna pledged to give away most of their wealth to effective charities. Young people changed career plans to maximize their social impact, sometimes earning high salaries in finance or technology, specifically to donate large amounts to effective organizations. Universities created research centers dedicated to effective altruism and global priorities research. Despite these new movements, building intentional communities remained attractive to many people seeking alternatives to mainstream society. Dancing Rabbit Eco-Village in Missouri represented one successful example of modern communal living. Founded in 1997, the community had grown to over 100 residents committed to environmental sustainability and cooperative decision-making. Members built homes from natural materials, grew their own food, and shared resources like tools and vehicles. They used consensus-based governance to make collective decisions and resolve conflicts. The community welcomed visitors and new members, while maintaining strong boundaries around shared values and environmental commitments. Tamara in Portugal took a different approach, focusing on healing trauma and developing what they called peace research biotopes. The community of about 170 people combined spiritual practices, permaculture, and social experimentation. They worked on healing sexual jealousy through transparent communication about relationships and emotions. They developed water retention landscapes and renewable energy systems. They hosted workshops and conferences to share their discoveries with visitors from around the world. Auroville in India continued growing after more than 50 years of existence, housing over 3,000 residents from 60 countries. The community, originally inspired by Indian philosopher Sri Aurobindo and his collaborator the Mother, aimed to create a place where people could live in harmony regardless of nationality, religion or social background. Residents engaged in diverse economic activities from education to sustainable agriculture to artistic creation. The community faced ongoing challenges with governance, as consensus decision-making became more difficult as the population grew, but it remained an influential experiment in international cooperation and spiritual development. Looking toward the future, new technologies suggested even more radical possibilities for utopian societies. Artificial intelligence was advancing rapidly, with systems already capable of beating humans at complex games, generating realistic images and text, and making sophisticated predictions. Some researchers believed that artificial general intelligence, matching or exceeding human intelligence across all domains, might be developed within decades. Such technology could potentially eliminate scarcity by automating all forms of production and service work. Humans might be freed from tedious labor to pursue creativity, relationships, and personal development. However, the same technology also posed existential risks if not carefully controlled and aligned with human values. Genetic engineering offered the possibility of eliminating genetic diseases, extending healthy human lifespan and potentially enhancing human capabilities. CRISPR and other gene editing tools were already being used to treat previously incurable conditions. Some researchers speculated about more dramatic interventions that could eliminate aging, increase intelligence, or enhance emotional well-being. Such technologies raised profound questions about human nature and equality. If genetic enhancements were expensive, they might create new forms of inequality between enhanced and unenhanced humans. If they were widely available, they might fundamentally change what it meant to be human. Space colonization represented another frontier for utopian experimentation. Companies like SpaceX were working to make space travel much cheaper and more routine. Some visionaries imagined millions of people living in orbital colonies or on other planets, each potentially experimenting with different forms of social organization. The harsh environment of space would require high levels of cooperation and careful resource management, potentially encouraging more collaborative and sustainable societies. The vast resources of the solar system, including energy from the sun and materials from asteroids, could support much larger populations than Earth, while reducing environmental pressures on the home planet. Virtual and augmented reality technologies might allow people to experience perfect digital worlds while maintaining physical bodies on Earth. People could work and socialize in virtual environments designed to be maximally beautiful, interesting, and fulfilling. Physical constraints on architecture, geography, and even physics itself could be overcome in digital spaces. However, such technologies also raised questions about the value of physical reality and embodied experience. Laboratory-grown meat and other cellular agriculture technologies promise to eliminate factory farming and its associated animal suffering and environmental damage. Companies were working to produce meat, dairy, and other animal products from cell cultures rather than live animals. If successful, these technologies could provide familiar foods without the ethical and environmental problems of conventional animal agriculture. Similar technologies might eventually produce any biological material, from wood to leather to exotic foods, without depleting natural ecosystems. Despite these technological possibilities, serious challenges remained for any future utopian project. Climate change was already causing significant disruption and threatened much worse consequences if greenhouse gas emissions continued increasing. Even with rapid deployment of renewable energy and other solutions, some degree of climate change was already locked in due to past emissions. Sea level rise, extreme weather, and agricultural disruption would create enormous challenges for human societies over the coming decades. Economic inequality was increasing in most countries, with the richest individuals accumulating unprecedented wealth, while many working-class communities struggled with declining opportunities. This inequality threatened social cohesion and democratic governance as wealthy elites gained disproportionate political influence. New technologies might worsen inequality if their benefits accrued primarily to capital owners rather than workers. Political polarization and declining trust in institutions made collective action more difficult just when global challenges required unprecedented cooperation. Social media and other information technologies had made it easier for people to live in separate information bubbles and view political opponents as enemies, rather than fellow citizens with legitimate disagreements. Authoritarian movements were gaining strength in many countries, threatening democratic norms and international cooperation. The threat of nuclear war remained despite the end of the Cold War, with more countries acquiring nuclear weapons and existing arsenals being modernized. Even a limited nuclear exchange could cause enormous humanitarian and environmental damage, while a full-scale nuclear war could end industrial civilization and possibly cause human extinction. Biological weapons posed another existential risk, particularly as biotechnology became more powerful and accessible. Engineered pandemics could potentially kill far more people than natural diseases, and the knowledge needed to create such weapons was becoming more widely available. The COVID-19 pandemic had shown how unprepared societies were for even naturally occurring disease outbreaks. The artificial intelligence alignment problem represented perhaps the most novel existential risk facing humanity. As AI systems became more powerful, ensuring that they remained beneficial and controllable became increasingly important and difficult. Current AI systems were trained to maximize specific objectives, but they lacked human wisdom about what objectives were actually valuable. A superintelligent AI system optimizing for the wrong goal could potentially cause enormous damage even if its creators had good intentions. Solving this alignment problem required advances in computer science, philosophy and governance that might not keep pace with the development of increasingly powerful AI systems. The effective altruism movement had emerged as one of the most systematic approaches to addressing these challenges. Rather than assuming that good intentions were sufficient, effective altruists tried to measure and compare the impact of different interventions. They had identified several promising approaches to reducing global suffering and existential risk. Direct cash transfers to poor people, like those tested in UBI experiments, appeared to be one of the most cost-effective ways to improve human welfare. Malaria prevention programs could save lives very cheaply in developing countries. Farm animal welfare reforms could reduce suffering for billions of sentient beings at relatively low cost. For addressing existential risks, effective altruists supported research into AI safety, biosecurity, nuclear security, and other areas where small investments in research and policy could potentially prevent catastrophic outcomes. They also worked to improve institutional decision-making and international cooperation on global challenges. The movement demonstrated how utopian aspirations could be channeled into practical action based on evidence rather than ideology. Instead of trying to design perfect societies from scratch, effective altruists focused on identifying and scaling up interventions that were already working. They combined moral ambition with intellectual humility, acknowledging uncertainty while still taking action to improve the world. This pragmatic approach to utopian thinking might offer the best hope for addressing contemporary challenges. Rather than waiting for perfect solutions or complete social transformation, people could work incrementally to reduce suffering and increase flourishing using the best available evidence about what actually worked. Such an approach could potentially achieve many of the goals of traditional utopian movements while avoiding some of their characteristic blind spots and excesses. The story of modern utopian thinking thus remained unfinished, with both unprecedented challenges and unprecedented opportunities ahead. The failures of recent decades had taught valuable lessons about the complexity of social systems and the difficulty of predicting unintended consequences. However, they had not eliminated the human need for hope and vision about possible better futures. New movements were emerging that combined traditional utopian aspirations with more sophisticated understanding of evidence, experimentation, and incremental change. Whether these approaches would prove more successful than their predecessors remained to be seen, but they represented humanity's continued refusal to accept current suffering and injustice as inevitable or permanent. Lessons learned from 4,000 years of utopian dreams. 4,000 years ago, in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, ancient Sumerian scribes carved stories into clay tablets about a perfect garden where humans lived in harmony with nature and each other. They called it Eden, a place where pain, death, and conflict did not exist. Little did these early storytellers know that they were beginning humanity's longest-running experiment in dreaming about perfect societies. From that moment forward, across every continent and culture, humans would continue to imagine, plan, design, and attempt to build utopian communities where all problems would be solved and everyone would live in happiness. The word utopia itself comes from the Greek philosopher Thomas More, who coined it in 1516 when he wrote about an imaginary island society where private property did not exist. Everyone worked only 6 hours per day, and gold was so worthless that people made chamber pots from it. More created his word by combining the Greek terms ou, meaning not, and topos, meaning place, literally creating the concept of no place or nowhere. Yet despite this built-in acknowledgement that perfect societies might not actually exist anywhere, humans have spent the following 5 centuries trying to prove more wrong by creating real utopian communities in the physical world. The story of these attempts reveals fascinating patterns about human nature, social organization, and what actually works when people try to live together in harmony. After studying thousands of utopian experiments across cultures and centuries, researchers have discovered that certain elements appear repeatedly in successful communities, while specific failures doom others to collapse within months or years. These patterns teach us valuable lessons about building better societies, even if perfect ones remain beyond our reach. The most striking discovery from 4 millennia of utopian experiments is that size matters tremendously. Small communities of 50 to 500 people have achieved remarkable success in creating harmonious, sustainable societies that last for decades or even centuries. The Hutterite religious communities, founded in 1528 in Europe and later transplanted to North America, have maintained their communal lifestyle for nearly 500 years. These groups deliberately keep their communities small, typically splitting into new settlements when membership exceeds 150 people. Their success comes from intimate knowledge of every community member, shared religious beliefs that provide clear moral guidelines, and economic systems based on mutual support rather than individual competition. Similarly, the Amish communities that began in 1693 have thrived for over 300 years by maintaining small, tight-knit groups focused on simple living, agricultural sustainability, and strong family bonds. Unlike modern society's emphasis on technological progress and material accumulation, Amish communities deliberately choose older technologies and simpler lifestyles that strengthen community bonds rather than isolating individuals. Their success demonstrates that voluntary simplicity, when chosen collectively, can create remarkably stable and satisfying social arrangements. In contrast, large-scale utopian attempts involving thousands or millions of people have consistently failed throughout history. The Soviet Union's attempt to create a communist paradise collapsed after 70 years, leaving behind environmental destruction, economic chaos, and millions of deaths. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China promised to create a perfect socialist society, but instead produced famine, persecution, and social upheaval that killed tens of millions. These massive failures teach us that human-scale communities work better than grand social engineering projects that try to remake entire civilizations. The second crucial lesson from utopian history involves the absolute necessity of voluntary participation. Every successful utopian community has allowed members to join and leave freely, while every forced utopia has quickly transformed into a dystopian nightmare. The Israeli kibbutz movement, which began in the early 1900s, created hundreds of successful agricultural communes that lasted for decades precisely because membership remained voluntary. Young people could choose to stay and continue the communal lifestyle, or leave to pursue individual careers in mainstream Israeli society. This freedom of choice prevented the resentment and rebellion that destroys forced communities. Conversely, when governments try to force utopian ideals on unwilling populations, the results are invariably catastrophic. Cambodia's Khmer Rouge attempted to create an agrarian paradise by forcing millions of city dwellers to work in rural communes, resulting in the deaths of approximately 2 million people between 1975 and 1979. The lesson is clear. Utopian dreams become dystopian realities when people cannot choose their own level of participation. The third essential element for utopian success involves shared values and clear goals that unite community members around common purposes. The most enduring utopian communities have been built around powerful shared beliefs, whether religious faith, environmental commitment, or social justice ideals. Christian monastic communities have maintained communal lifestyles for over 1,500 years because members share deep spiritual convictions about the value of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These shared values create strong social bonds that help communities weather conflicts and challenges that would destroy groups lacking common purpose. Environmental communities like those established during the 1960s counterculture movement have achieved varying degrees of success depending on how clearly they define their shared values. Communities focused solely on rejecting mainstream society often collapse quickly due to internal conflicts and lack of direction. However, communities organized around specific environmental goals, such as organic farming, renewable energy development, or wildlife conservation, tend to maintain cohesion and purpose over longer periods. The fourth critical factor involves democratic decision-making processes that prevent authoritarian corruption. History teaches us that power corrupts even well-intentioned leaders, and utopian communities are particularly vulnerable to charismatic leaders who promise perfect solutions to complex problems. The most successful communities have developed democratic structures that distribute power among multiple leaders and require consensus or majority approval for major decisions. Religious communities like the Bruderhof, founded in Germany in 1920 and later established in the United States, have maintained democratic governance for over a century by rotating leadership positions and requiring community approval for major decisions. Members regularly gather in assemblies where everyone can voice opinions and participate in choosing directions for the community. This democratic approach prevents any single leader from accumulating too much power and imposing personal visions on the entire group. In contrast, many utopian experiments have collapsed when charismatic founders became authoritarian leaders who brooked no opposition to their visions. Jim Jones's People's Temple began as an idealistic religious community promoting racial integration and social justice, but transformed into a deadly cult when Jones assumed absolute power over members' lives. The tragic ending at Jonestown in Guyana, where over 900 people died in a mass murder-suicide, demonstrates how quickly utopian dreams can become nightmares when democratic governance disappears. Economic sustainability represents the fifth essential requirement for long-term utopian success. Communities must develop viable economic systems that provide for members' material needs without exploiting outside resources or depending on unsustainable subsidies. The most successful utopian communities have created diversified economies based on agriculture, crafts, small-scale manufacturing, or services that generate steady income streams. The kibbutz movement succeeded for decades because communities developed profitable agricultural enterprises that exported products to national and international markets. Many kibbutzim became leading producers of citrus fruits, dairy products, and later high-tech equipment, generating wealth that supported comfortable lifestyles for members. However, when global economic changes made some kibbutz enterprises unprofitable in the 1980s and 1990s, many communities had to abandon pure communalism and adopt more individualistic economic arrangements to survive. The Oneida community, established in New York State in 1848, created a successful manufacturing business producing steel traps and silverware that supported the community for over 30 years. When founder John Humphrey Noyes fled to Canada to avoid prosecution for his unconventional marriage arrangements, community members decided to transform their commune into a joint stock company that continued operating profitably for decades. This transition demonstrates how economic sustainability can outlast the original utopian vision. Understanding why utopias fail provides equally important lessons for anyone interested in building better communities. The primary reason involves conflicts between human nature and utopian ideals that assume people will consistently act selflessly and cooperatively. Most utopian theories assume that removing private property, competition, and social hierarchies will eliminate human selfishness, status-seeking, and laziness. However, 4,000 years of experiments demonstrate that these traits persist even in the most carefully designed communities. The Oneida community practiced complex marriage, where every man was considered married to every woman, and exclusive romantic relationships were discouraged. The system worked temporarily under the strong leadership of founder Noyes, but younger members increasingly rebelled against restrictions on forming permanent partnerships. Human desires for exclusive romantic bonds and nuclear families ultimately proved stronger than communal ideals about shared relationships. Similarly, many communes established during the 1960s counterculture movement collapsed when members discovered that eliminating private property did not eliminate disputes over resource allocation. Even in communities where everything was supposed to be shared equally, conflicts arose over who got to use the best tools, sleep in the most comfortable rooms, or eat the choicest food. Human tendencies toward fairness and reciprocity create problems in communities that assume everyone will contribute equally without external incentives or enforcement mechanisms. Leadership corruption represents the second major cause of utopian failure. Even leaders who begin with genuine commitment to egalitarian ideals often succumb to the temptations of power and privilege. The history of utopian communities is littered with founders who started as humble servants of their communities, but gradually accumulated special privileges, sexual access to multiple partners, and exemption from the rules that governed ordinary members. David Koresh of the Branch Davidian community in Waco, Texas, began as a sincere religious seeker, but gradually claimed divine authority that allowed him multiple wives while requiring celibacy from other male members. His accumulation of weapons and increasingly paranoid worldview ultimately led to the tragic confrontation with federal agents that killed over 80 community members in 1993. This pattern repeats throughout utopian history. Charismatic leaders who promise paradise but deliver tyranny. External pressure from mainstream society provides the third common cause of utopian failure. Even communities that solve internal problems often struggle with hostile neighbours, government persecution, economic competition from outside businesses, and cultural influences that attract members away from communal lifestyles. The early Christian communist communities described in the New Testament apparently dissolved within decades as members integrated into broader Roman society and adopted conventional economic arrangements. The Shaker communities, which practiced celibacy and lived in gender-segregated housing while creating beautiful furniture and architecture, thrived during the 18th and 19th centuries, but gradually declined as mainstream society became more accepting of their pacifist and egalitarian values. Young people no longer felt the need to join separate communities to practice these ideals, and the Shaker commitment to celibacy prevented natural population growth. Today, only a handful of elderly Shakers remain from communities that once numbered in the thousands. Economic unsustainability and resource conflicts create the fourth major pathway to utopian failure. Many communities begin with generous financial support from wealthy founders or enthusiastic donations from sympathetic outsiders, but struggle to develop self-sustaining economic systems. When initial funding runs out or donor enthusiasm wanes, communities face difficult choices between abandoning their ideals or accepting economic collapse. The Transcendentalist community at Brook Farm in Massachusetts, founded in 1841 by intellectuals seeking to combine manual labor with scholarly pursuits, attracted famous writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Margaret Fuller, but never developed viable economic enterprises. Members spent more time discussing philosophy than farming, and the community accumulated debts that ultimately forced its dissolution after 6 years. The experiment demonstrated that good intentions and intellectual brilliance cannot substitute for practical economic planning. Resource conflicts within communities also destroy utopian harmony when members compete for scarce goods or disagree about resource allocation priorities. The Rajneeshpuram community, established in Oregon during the 1980s, accumulated significant wealth through donations and business enterprises, but collapsed amid internal power struggles over controlling community resources. When leader Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his secretary Ma Anand Sheela disagreed about spending priorities, their conflict split the community and led to criminal charges against several leaders for immigration fraud, poisoning local residents, and other illegal activities. The suppression of individual freedom and creativity represents the fifth common cause of utopian failure. Many communities, in their enthusiasm for equality and harmony, create rules and social pressures that stifle individual expression and personal growth. Members who feel trapped or constrained eventually rebel against communal restrictions or simply leave for mainstream society, where they can pursue individual interests more freely. The Amana colonies in Iowa, founded by German pietists in 1855, maintained successful communal arrangements for over 80 years, but gradually relaxed their restrictions on individual expression as younger members demanded more personal freedom. By 1932, community members voted to abandon communalism and reorganize as a conventional corporation that allowed private property and individual economic pursuits. The transition preserved the community's physical structure and cultural traditions, while acknowledging that rigid communalism could not satisfy members' desires for personal autonomy. Despite these common failure patterns, Several utopian communities have achieved remarkable longevity by avoiding the typical pitfalls. The Hutterite communities represent perhaps the most successful example of sustained communalism in world history. Beginning with small groups of Anabaptist Christians in 16th century Europe, Hutterite communities have maintained their communal lifestyle through centuries of persecution, migration, and cultural change. Today, over 50,000 Hutterites live in approximately 500 communities across North America, continuing traditions of shared property, collective decision-making, and mutual support that began nearly 5 centuries ago. The key to Hutterite success lies in their ability to balance community needs with individual concerns. While property remains communal, individuals have considerable freedom in choosing their work roles, marriage partners, and daily activities. The communities maintain strong religious identity while adapting to changing economic and technological circumstances. Most importantly, members can leave freely if they choose, preventing the resentment that builds in forced communities. The Israeli kibbutz movement demonstrates another path to utopian success through voluntary participation and democratic governance. Beginning with small groups of young Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century, the kibbutz movement grew to include hundreds of communities housing over 100,000 members at its peak. These agricultural communes pioneered innovative farming techniques, developed successful industries, and created egalitarian societies, where members shared both labor and rewards equally. The kibbutz movement's success came from combining idealistic commitment with practical flexibility. Communities experimented with different approaches to child-rearing, economic organization, and social relationships, while maintaining core commitments to equality and mutual support. When economic pressures forced changes during the 1980s and 1990s, many kibbutzim adapted by allowing private property and individual economic activity while preserving essential community bonds. Monastic communities worldwide provide perhaps the longest record of successful utopian living. Christian monasteries, Buddhist temples, and Hindu ashrams have maintained communal lifestyles for over 1,500 years by combining spiritual purpose with practical organization. These communities succeed because they offer clear meaning and purpose to members while providing structured environments that support both individual growth and collective harmony. The longevity of monastic communities demonstrates that humans can live successfully in communal arrangements when those arrangements serve deeper purposes than mere material comfort. Members accept restrictions on personal freedom and property rights because they gain spiritual benefits that matter more than individual autonomy. The key insight is that successful communalism requires transcendent purposes that motivate voluntary sacrifice of individual interests for collective goods. Academic research on utopian communities provides scientific validation for these historical lessons. Harvard sociologist Rosabeth Moss Kanter conducted the most comprehensive study of 19th century American communes, analyzing 91 communities to identify factors that distinguish successful groups from failures. Her research revealed 6 essential requirements for communal success that she labeled sacrifice, investment, renunciation, communion, mortification, and transcendence. Sacrifice refers to the requirement that members give up something valuable to join the community, creating psychological investment in the group's success. Investment involves contributing money, property, or labor that cannot be easily recovered if members leave, further increasing commitment to community survival. Renunciation means giving up relationships or activities that compete with community loyalty, focusing members' emotional energy on collective rather than individual concerns. Communion involves creating strong emotional bonds among members through shared rituals, common experiences, and mutual support systems. Mortification requires members to accept criticism and guidance from the community, subordinating individual ego to collective wisdom. Transcendence provides members with higher purposes or meanings that justify the sacrifices required by communal living. Cantor's statistical analysis revealed remarkable differences in longevity between communities that implemented these mechanisms and those that did not. Communities that required all 6 commitment mechanisms lasted an average of 25 years, while communities that implemented none lasted only 2 years on average. This research provides scientific support for the historical pattern that successful utopian communities require genuine commitment and sacrifice from members rather than simply good intentions or attractive ideals. Modern academic perspectives on utopian thinking emphasize its positive contributions to social progress despite the frequent failures of specific communities. Sociologist Ruth Levitas argues that utopian thinking serves as the education of desire, helping people understand what they really want from life and society. By imagining better alternatives to current arrangements, utopian thinkers identify problems that need solving and motivate efforts to create improvements. Philosopher Ernst Bloch identified hope as a fundamental human drive that creates possibilities for better futures. According to Bloch, utopian thinking represents humanity's refusal to accept current limitations as permanent, generating creative energy that produces real social progress over time. Even failed utopian experiments contribute to this process by testing ideas and providing lessons for future efforts. Political scientist James C. Scott advocates for small-scale, voluntary experiments rather than grand schemes that try to remake entire societies. Scott's research on high modernist projects like urban planning, agricultural collectivization, and social engineering demonstrates that top-down utopian schemes typically fail because they ignore local knowledge and individual preferences. However, small-scale voluntary communities can succeed because they work with human nature rather than against it. The psychological reasons for persistent utopian thinking reveal fundamental aspects of human nature that help explain why people continue dreaming of perfect societies despite thousands of failures. Humans naturally imagine better futures as a way of motivating action and maintaining hope during difficult circumstances. This forward-looking orientation helps individuals and groups survive challenges and work toward improvements rather than accepting current problems as unchangeable. Perfectionist thinking, while sometimes problematic in personal relationships, serves important social functions by identifying problems that need attention and generating pressure for reforms. The abolition of slavery, extension of voting rights to women and minorities, establishment of public education systems, creation of worker safety protections, and development of environmental regulations all began with utopian thinkers who imagined societies without these problems. Community building represents a basic human need that utopian experiments attempt to satisfy through intentional creation of supportive social networks. While mainstream society often fails to provide meaningful community connections, utopian groups deliberately design social arrangements that foster mutual support, shared purpose, and collective identity. Even failed communities often provide members with valuable experiences of genuine community that influence their later choices and relationships. The positive contributions of utopian thinking extend far beyond the specific communities that implement communal lifestyles. Social movements for civil rights, women's equality, environmental protection, and economic justice all draw inspiration from utopian visions of better societies. These movements achieve concrete improvements by mobilizing people around shared ideals and creating pressure for specific reforms. The environmental movement exemplifies how utopian thinking translates into practical improvements. Beginning with transcendentalist writers like Henry David Thoreau, who experimented with simple living at Walden Pond, environmental utopians have imagined societies based on harmony with nature rather than domination over it. These visions inspired conservation efforts, pollution regulations, renewable energy development, and sustainable agriculture practices that benefit everyone, not just members of intentional communities. Scientific research and technological innovation also benefit from utopian thinking that imagines possibilities beyond current limitations. The Internet began with utopian visions of global communication networks that would democratize information and connect people across traditional boundaries. While the reality of Internet culture includes many problems that early visionaries did not anticipate, the underlying utopian impulse created technologies that have transformed human communication and knowledge sharing. The paradox of utopian thinking lies in the recognition that perfect societies remain impossible to achieve, while efforts to create them produce real improvements in human welfare. This paradox suggests that the journey toward utopia matters more than reaching the destination, and that utopian thinking provides essential moral guidance for social progress, even when specific utopian experiments fail. The story of utopian dreams spans 4,000 years because these dreams address fundamental human needs for meaning, community, justice, and hope. Every generation faces problems that seem intractable and injustices that demand correction, leading thoughtful people to imagine how society could be organized differently to eliminate these problems. While their specific solutions often prove impractical or naive, their identification of problems and commitment to improvement creates pressure for reforms that benefit everyone. The greatest utopian successes have consistently involved small communities of people who choose to live together based on shared values and mutual support. These communities work because they operate at human scale, allow voluntary participation, maintain democratic governance, develop economic sustainability, and provide meaning that transcends individual self-interest. Whether religious like the Hutterites and Amish, secular like the kibbutzim, or spiritual like monastic communities, successful utopian groups demonstrate that humans can create harmonious societies when conditions align properly. The greatest utopian failures have involved large-scale attempts to remake entire societies through authoritarian enforcement of utopian ideals. These failures teach us that human nature resists forced perfection, and that sustainable improvements must work with, rather than against, basic human needs for autonomy, recognition, and individual expression. The tragic history of communist states, fascist movements, and other totalist experiments demonstrates that the road to hell is indeed paved with utopian intentions when those intentions become excuses for oppression. The final lesson from 4 millennia of utopian experimentation is that perfect societies may be impossible, but the human drive to create them has produced most of our social progress. Democracy, human rights, public education, healthcare systems, environmental protection, and countless other improvements began as utopian dreams that seemed impossible to practical-minded people of their time. Today's normal arrangements were yesterday's utopian fantasies, suggesting that current utopian dreams may become tomorrow's social realities. The story of utopia ultimately tells us about human hope, creativity, and determination to build better worlds despite repeated failures and setbacks. As long as humans exist, we will continue dreaming of paradise and working to create it, one small community at a time. These dreams keep alive the possibility that life could be better than it is, motivating the endless human project of social improvement that makes civilization possible. In this sense, utopian thinking succeeds not by creating perfect societies, but by preventing us from accepting imperfect ones as the best we can achieve.